So what we're going to do here is Matt Brielle and I are going to do an overview of the stimulus packages that we have so far. We have the CARES Act and CRRSA, or CRRSA, whichever one you call it. But the way we're going to set up this presentation is I'm going to provide a quick overview at the beginning, just a side-by-side view of the two different acts, just to give everybody the big picture. And then Matt and Brielle are going to dive into the details, and they're going to really get into the nitty-gritty about the two programs. And so what I'm going to do is, as I give the overview, if you have questions, jot them down on a piece of paper and wait to see if Matt and Brielle answer those. Because like I said, they're really going to get into the details, where we're just going to start with the big picture. So with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide, please. So just to start off with, we have the CARES Act that was passed back in March, brought $30 billion to the country in K-12 education. And what that did was created what we call the Educational Stabilization Fund. And underneath the Ed Stabilization Fund is two streams of money, if you will. The first, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Fund, which we are calling ESSER, and then the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which we call GEAR. And then in December, CRRSA was passed by Congress and signed by the President. And that brought $82 billion of federal funds to K-12 education. And what that did was it furthered the Education Stabilization Fund. So it provided more money within those two existing pots of funds that we call ESSER and what we call GEAR. So when we're talking about CRRSA, a lot of people may be calling it ESSER 2 or GEAR 2. And so that's one way people are keeping the acts separated from one another. The other thing I do want to mention about CRRSA, and again, Matt and Brielle are going to talk about this in detail, is under the GEAR program in CRRSA, Congress created an Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program, which is we're calling EANS. So that is a program that's DPI is specifically providing those services to private schools. And like I said, we'll dive into that in just a minute. So next slide, please. So Ed Stabilization Fund, again, it applies to both acts, and it's intended to meet the needs from COVID, specifically ensuring health and safety for students and staff and teachers, developing and implementing plans for the continuation of instruction, and then also providing resources, whether it be student devices, hotspots, data plans, and then other services such as those mental health supports for staff, students, and families. What CRRSA did was it includes everything under the CARES Act, but it also has an additional emphasis on addressing learning loss and preparing schools to reopen safely. Next slide, please. There we go. So here are some of the things that are common between the two acts. They're both federal stimulus packages to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19. Both of them provide pots of funds for grants to LEAs, so school districts and independent charter schools. There is no supplement, not supplant provision under either program, and the use of funds is very, very flexible. That being said, EDGAR, uniform grant guidance, and your district policies still apply to these funds. So even though the use of funds is incredibly flexible, we still have to follow EDGAR, we still need to follow the uniform grant guidance, and we still need to follow your policies within your own entity. The other thing to point out is that maintenance of effort is determined at the state level and not at the LEA level for these two programs. Next slide. So if we're going to dive into ESSER, this is that first stream of funding for districts. ESSER 1 brought about $140 million to the state of Wisconsin, and the performance period was from March 13th of 2020 through September 30th of 2022. It provided a minimum grant for all districts as at $40,000, and it also included some investments in statewide initiatives, which again, Matt and Brielle are going to dive into what those are. With CRRSA or CRRSA, it brought $686 million to the state of Wisconsin, and this is the largest federal funding program that Congress has ever appropriated for K-12 education. Now, this program or performance period also started back in March 13th, but this goes through 2023. So we are encouraging folks to spend down your ESSER $1 and then tap into your ESSER $2. The reason there are two asterisks between March 13th of 2020 under CRRSA is because you are able to costs between March 13th and June 30th, 2020 to the ESSER II grant. That is allowed, but the reason we have those asterisks there is that you really need to talk to your auditors about going back and charging those back costs, because technically the audit is done and the books are done books are closed for that fiscal year. So if you go backwards, talk to your auditor to make sure that you have all your bases covered so we don't have any unintended audit findings. Under ESSER II, there's a $100,000 minimum for all districts, so that's obviously a little bit more than what's under CARES. And then there is an additional $65 million that will be available to 174 districts who did not meet a minimum per pupil allocation of $395. So if a district received $100,000 or more, but did not reach $395 per student, then an additional formula grant will be available. But it's going to be based on in-person instruction during the 2021 school year. So again, Matt and Brielle are going to dive into that a little bit in just a few minutes. So next slide, please. ESSER 1, long list of allowable activities, and again, ESSER 2, really focusing on safely opening schools and addressing and assessing learning loss. ESSER 1, LEAs need to provide equitable services to private schools, but ESSER 2, LEAs do not need to do that. The state is going to take that on. Next slide, please. And then if we talk about GEAR, that second stream of funding to districts, again, the performance periods are the same as ESSER, but again, under GEAR 1, it goes until 2022, GEAR 2, 23. GEAR 1, right now we have $46 million in grants that are going to 156 districts and 3 tribal schools. And there is an equitable services provision for LEAs who are receiving GEAR 1. GEAR 2, right now, the governor's office is still in the process of determining if there will be grants to LEAs. We don't know where that decision is at this point in time. But what we do know, because there was a separate appropriation specifically under that EANS program that brings $77 million to services for private schools. And like I had mentioned earlier, those services will be provided by DPI and not the LEAs. Next slide, please. And then just lastly, for this quick overview, the reporting. There is reporting requirements for CARES and for CRRSA. We believe that they're going to be very closely aligned. So our CARES reporting just is wrapping up here for this first round of CARES reporting for both ESSER 1 and GEAR 1. And it covered things like FTE data, how the funds were being spent. We are anticipating, we do not have this confirmed yet, but we are anticipating though for CRRSA, so for ESSER 2, that we're going to have an additional focus on safely reopening schools and assessing and addressing learning loss. That is our prediction at this point in time, and we are waiting for U.S. Department of Ed to provide us more guidance regarding that, but this is where we're at right now.